All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jennifer Reinwald, and I am the Vice Principal of Student Life and Mission at Carondelet High School. Spencer Shively, who's the Vice President of Mission and Student Life at De La Salle, was going to meet with us or join the webinar, but he is unable to due to connectivity issues. Due to having no power or no Wi-Fi at home. But he wanted to welcome all of you as well. We're going to get started with prayer, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker. Before I do that, though, I want to mention to everyone we are recording this webinar, so we will make it available to you to review at a later time. Also, I have enabled the Q&A feature. So if you have a question at any point during this webinar, go ahead and type that into the Q&A section. Debbie will be available at the very end for Q&A, as well as if you have any specific questions about services at Carondelet, I will be answering that as well. If you have questions specific to De La Salle, you can reach Spencer Shively via his email. But we're going to go ahead and get started with prayer. So in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. This evening, may I stand in solidarity today with all my brothers and sisters around the world who are suffering. May we be united in your love, and may I work to bring your kingdom here on earth. And this very windy, stormy evening, be with everyone traveling to make sure that they get home safely, and also for all of the people working outside on the downed trees and down power lines, that everyone gets home safely. Amen. All right, so now I'm going to introduce our speaker. So our speaker is Debbie Burnt. She works with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, known as SAMHSA, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She has served as a marijuana subject matter expert on several of their projects and hosts the podcasts, What Parents Are Saying, which is part of the nationally recognized Talk They Hear You prevention campaign for parents. She is also the director for Parent Movement 2.0 and Substance-Free Athletics, both educational programs designed to educate and assist in reducing underage substance use through highly targeted curriculum and messaging. Welcome, Debbie. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with everybody. I would add to my intro that I am also the parent of 3 kids. I have a 27-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 19-year-old. With that 8-year spread between them, I have been a high school parent for 12 years. So I have sat in the position that you're in for a long time. I am recently this year an empty nester. That is great too. So we have a pretty big topic today, the 21st century understanding of marijuana, fentanyl, and prevention for parents. And so we start this by just recognizing that we have like 2 or really 3 decades of scientific research, social science, and data analysis that's uncovered the biomechanics of all the drugs that we use and has profoundly changed the way we understand brain development. Unfortunately, and really not surprisingly, if you're not in the prevention space or working in substance science in some way, people are generally completely unaware of all of this. That includes parents, who really are probably the group that needs to understand all of it the most. So we're going to dive in and bring you guys up to date. And to start, in its most simple terms, all of that research has been summarized into a new health standard. And that standard is no use of any substances when young for reasons of health. So if we say that fast, it doesn't really even sound like that much. But if we think about that for a minute, it can be kind of daunting. Really, no use at all, not even a beer in high school? So how are we going to really break that down and get started? So First thing I want to do is offer that this is just like any other health standard. Think about seatbelts and helmets. Those were not part of our lives when we were young, but they are imperative today. I don't think any of us would let our kids ride in a car or go down a slope without a helmet on their heads. The reason we adopted these standards is because of decades of research and analysis and experience that has proven that these help keep our kids safe, that these help our kids get to adulthood. So, but we know substance use is a little bit harder. And so there's an amazing public health organization called IBH, the Institute for Behavior and Health. And I've had the opportunity to work with them and a curriculum that they have for teens called One Choice. And we have devised what is being called the One Choice 5, Prevention Basics for Parents. And they were developed to help parents think about prevention and integrate its importance in a practical way into their lives. The framework starts by recognizing or letting parents know that drug and alcohol use by young people is not inevitable. Most parents tend to think that it's a given. The One Choice 5 also encourages parents to become brain development savvy. Brain-based parenting is a real opportunity today, and it's good to know as much as possible. We also need to become substance savvy. Our kids are exposed to a lot, and they generally know more than we do about drugs, even if what they know is incorrect, because there is so much misinformation out there. Tonight, we're going to talk about marijuana and fentanyl specifically. Fourth, parents need to talk early and talk often with their kids about drugs and alcohol. And lastly, as parents, if we expect or suspect use, we need to act quickly. The "oh, kids will be kids" response to a crazy night out is kind of a dated response. So let's get into a little more detail by starting with that first idea that youth substance use is actually not inevitable. So this can be kind of hard to accept as true, especially when we think and we hear things like kids need to learn how to drink responsibly before they go to college, or we feel like maybe our kids will be left out socially if they're not at the party and if they're not participating, or I know they're going to drink anyway, so I want them to drink at my house so they'll be safe, or I used when I was young, what's the big deal? I'm fine, it's just a little beer. These notions can actually be deeply seated beliefs for many of us, including myself. And there's a really fascinating reason why this is the case. And it's based on this crazy fact that our kids use less today than we used when we were in high school. If you can even wrap your heads around that. This chart shows that all drug use for high school seniors has been going down for the last 5 decades. Except for marijuana, which has been trending up since the mid-1990s, which does map to the legalization movement. But in general, use is going down. And that says, but that said, our kids do drink and drug differently than we did. That 6-pack of beer now shows up at the party as a handle of vodka, and there are canned beverages that contain 4 or 5 beers worth of alcohol that our kids have access to. Brands like Four Loko are binge drinking in a can. All they can get is supercharged weed as compared to what we might have smoked. And we'll talk about that more later. And then there's just this general ethos that a pill can solve everything. So the casual using of pills has seeped into our entire culture. Another thing that's interesting about this is we can flip this chart and look at non-use among high school seniors that really just reflects the chart we just saw in upside down. Most parents of high school kids today were in high school themselves in the late 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. So find your graduation year on this chart. This chart always makes me laugh a little bit. That very low dip down there at the bottom is 1983, and what that which is my high school graduation year. And what that's saying is that in 1983, 3% of high school seniors had never drank or smoked. And then if you look at the number up, it's saying that 16% of high school seniors hadn't drank or smoked in the last 30 days. So that means 97% of us were drinking or smoking in 1983. And these were my people. We drank literally like crazy. If you roll up to today, we see, let's see, let me get my mouse over there. We see that basically 37% of high school seniors have never had a drink or smoked a cigarette or marijuana of any kind. It's staggering. It's hard to even believe. It's 10 times more than my graduating class. My gosh. And then if you look at the kids that haven't consumed it recently, that adds another 30, and we end up with a total of 63% of kids who have not used in the last 30 days. That last 30 days marker is a category kids can move in and out of, right? So to me, that's a really hopeful number. But it's also, so you know, how we assess or look at usage. We don't look at as a user of a drug or alcohol as someone who's ever had a hit off a bong or someone who's ever had a beer. They're not considered users. Users in all the statistical analysis have used in the last 30 days. Okay, so it's amazing, but you can also see the conundrum, right? How am I going to impose a different standard on my kids when I drink in college myself? Pretty hypocritical, Mom, right? So, but the simple answer is that we can, and for all the reasons that we're going to talk about today. So moving on to point number 2, the notion of becoming brain development savvy is actually really exciting. And to start this conversation, you need to know that the brain is a learning adaptive organ that grows and matures through feedback. Everything you do all day long, you get up, you get dressed, you interact with family and friends, you get in the car, you actually learn something, you become challenged by something old, you take a walk. Literally, everything you do results in feedback that comes in through your 5 senses, goes up through your central nervous system into your brain, gets translated into knowledge and stored into memory. It joins every other memory that you have from the previous moment, yesterday, last week, last year, your entire life. This makes your brain your repository of understanding. It makes your brain really who you are in the world and how you understand the world working. This comment at the bottom, the brain you go to bed with tonight is not the same brain you woke up with this morning, is another way to try and express that elasticity. And to be fair, this is exceptionally true for 0 to 25-year-olds. As we get older, our brain is not quite as dynamic, but it does change to some degree over our entire lives. Another brain basic we want you to know is the 3 major components of the brain, and I promise you, you're going to appreciate this. The first component is the brain stem. It's sometimes called the reptilian brain. It's where your core bodily functions are. So, you know, heartbeat and breathing and those kinds of things you don't think about, but that happen in your body automatically. And then it's where your really deep primal instincts are. Am I safe? Do I have enough to eat? Is anything going to hurt me? Wrapped around that is the mammalian brain, which is a much more emotional center. Do I trust? Where do I belong? How do I fit? Do I feel cared for? And then wrapped around that is the prefrontal cortex, which is that executive function, higher thinking kinds of ways that your brain processes, right and wrong, understanding cause and effect, impulse control, and self-awareness. So the reason this is interesting is because from 12 to 17, the human brain is focused in the limbic system. If we did an MRI on any of our 12 to 17-year-olds, their limbic system would be lit up, just on fire, process, process, process. When they turn 18, that limbic system calms down and that hyperactivity shifts to the prefrontal cortex and it lights up. So, and then when you're 26, most neurologists agree that's when the brain is fully myelinated in and you have an adult brain. That actually is a little bit longer for boys, and it can be different for different people. But in general, that is when the brain is considered fully developed. So Our 12 to 17-year-olds have some executive function. They know how to do what's right and wrong, but it's just not fully developed yet. This is why we have to keep parenting. They are highly emotional, but their rational brains are not fully online. We act as their prefrontal cortexes until that gets further developed. So if you've ever heard yourself or thought to yourself, oh my God, does this kid not have a brain in his head? Or why can't you do what I'm telling you to do? Or why would you do X, Y, or Z today when you did it yesterday and you fell on your face? It's all because of this. Their brains are not, they don't have a fully functioning prefrontal cortex. So if we circle back to alcohol and drugs, we know that those are very complicated neurologically, and that 12 to 17-year-old brains are just not ready for them. Lastly, we know that the adolescent brain can be injured more easily than adult brains, that neural tissue is very different from like bone and muscle and other kinds of tissues in the body. And I always like the example of my son can sprain his ankle and I swear he's back on a field in 15 minutes. I do it, it takes a month. He actually got a concussion when he was younger, and it took months for him to get over that. I got one, it took me a week. And that is because the tissue is just so different, and probably because of all of this neural activity that's going on. It just takes them longer to heal. So we want to protect those brains. We also want you to know that there is this pruning and myelination process going on during adolescence. Kids show up to puberty with the brain on the left. I think it's left as you're looking at it. And over the next 6 or 12 years, they end up with the brain on the right with robust, efficient circuits for processing information quickly and efficiently. They lose the circuitry that they don't need or use any longer. Everything from, they learned how to walk and they learned how to talk and they know apple starts with A. They don't need any of that circuitry anymore. But then also the circuitry they don't use. This is why we kind of lose the ability to learn languages. If we're not using them, they get pruned away. What stays is what they focus on and what they're repeatedly involved in or spend time on. That gets wired in or myelinated into the brain. So what are our kids spending time on? Hopefully it's their jump shot and algebra and relationships and music. And all those good things. Unfortunately, alcohol and drug use can get myelinated in as well. So I do love this next idea that adolescence, despite all of its messiness, brings major opportunities from a brain standpoint. If we understand this, we can better support our kids when we recognize this neurological development focus, which is on fit, belonging, and trust. That kind of explains why peer pressure is a thing and why peer influence is a thing. It allows us to, when we know that, it allows us to say things other than just, your friends make me crazy, or I wish you didn't hang out with those people. If we know they're looking for where they belong, we can start offering other ways of expressing belonging, like family or family history or church or community or service, that kind of can answer that question. It's not going to answer every question, but it helps us broaden our understanding or broaden the field that we're parenting in. And then there's this fact that they're supposed to be developing certain strategies, things like coping, connecting socially, handling stress, building intimacy, problem solving. I have also added having fun, and knowing that that's what they're doing and that's what we're watching can also, again, help broaden the field that we're parenting from. This last point, which I consider good news, is that if kids will show up to the challenges and the opportunities of adolescence sober, so without drugs and alcohol, so much of this learning just starts and develops organically. They are designed biologically to achieve this understanding and these skills through risk-taking and all kinds of things. I'm a big believer in education, but I have to tell you, after 12 years of parent education nights, honestly, I didn't want to hear anything else. No more do's and don'ts. Thank you very much. At some point, my organic ability to parent has to be enough. And this is something that I always found very comforting. There's really only one thing I need to do, and that's to help them navigate away from drugs and alcohol. And they are designed to really do the rest. I don't have to help them figure out how to cope and connect and all of that kind of stuff. They're designed to do that on their own. Okay, one last comment on executive function. These are the functions that are coming online in middle and high school and continue to develop through adulthood. And these are the skills that shape us into thinking, feeling, doing, fully self-supporting adults. They are acquired through risk-taking. These are also the skills that are arrested when we drink and drug young. There is this idea, again, called brain-based parenting, that you, or brain-based praise, that you can offer when you see your kids exhibiting these skills. Things like, I like how you paused for a moment when you responded to your friend. Nice thinking that through. Or it seems like you really took that other person's feelings into consideration before you X, Y, or Z. So onward to substances. We start with some general notes for you, like this idea that we now understand for teens, all substance use is related. You may have heard marijuana called a gateway drug, and you may have heard it debated. It is in fact true for several behavioral and biological conditioning reasons, but the one that I find most compelling is the fact that cannabinoids, and those are the things that make you high in marijuana, and opioids, that's something like heroin, ride on the same superfamily of neuroprocessors, G protein receptors. So if yours is going to be a brain that wants more once it starts using marijuana, that step off to a stronger drug like heroin is just not that far. Your brain is primed for it. And in fact, you have opened the gateway to that. Now, however, we look at the three majors as gateway drugs: alcohol, marijuana, and nicotine. Because they're all addictive, they're easily accessible to our teens, and teen brains are excessively vulnerable to their harms. Also, we see statistically that the use of one of these drugs generally means the use of the other drugs. So this is a graph of 12 to 17-year-olds that on the left side say that they do not use marijuana. And if we look at their use of the other drugs, they use them in very low levels, or at very low levels. On the right side, these are kids that said, yes, we do use marijuana. And we looked at the levels of use of the other drugs, and they used them at much higher levels. Those who said yes to marijuana were 5 times more likely to drink alcohol than those that did not. They were 8 times more likely to binge drink alcohol, and binge drinking is 4 to 5 drinks at a time. They were 15 times more likely to report heavy alcohol use, which is 4 to 5 binge sessions in a month. They were 9 times more likely to smoke cigarettes. They were 10 times more likely to use illicit drugs like heroin, cocaine, and MDMA. So you can see the connection, and you can see it in all the directions. The same was true for alcohol. No alcohol, much less use of marijuana, illicit drugs, and cigarettes. Yes to alcohol, much more use of marijuana, illicit drugs, and cigarettes. The same was true for cigarette use. Yes to cigarettes, less, or no to cigarettes, less drinking, less marijuana, less illicit drugs. Yes to cigarettes, more drinking, more marijuana, more illicit drugs. The other thing we know is that normalization increases substance use among our kids. And normalization is how society makes drug and alcohol products and their use normal in our culture. We do it by how we talk, our own use, depictions of these things in media, and whether these things are legal or not. Normalization also changes what are called environmental protective factors, like they cause you see when the environmental protective factors are gone, you see access and visibility to the drug going up. You see the perception of harm going down. And most people don't know that these kinds of protective factors exist. In fact, that low access and an honest perception of harm really do protect our kids. From normalization in general and also legalization specifically smash these protective factors and go on to create, especially with marijuana legalization, a just immediate psychological shift from this drug is probably bad for me to it's probably okay for me. They made it legal. And we all experience that shift, no matter how old we are. The calculus of use changes as well. What was once a small group decision, do we have money? Does anybody know a dealer? Do we have a car? How are we getting there? When it comes to marijuana use, becomes this mass marketed and social media encouraged directive to use. And for any of you that are in marketing out there, the language, the feature and benefit language and the imagery that accompanies commercialized weed is truly staggering. So let's bounce into marijuana. We're focusing on this drug tonight because it is everywhere, and because there is so much to know, and there's a lot of misinformation. We start with a little more brain science, but I first want to make sure everyone understands that marijuana, weed, pot, and cannabis, the Latin name, are all the same thing. Doesn't matter what term we're using, we're talking about the same thing. Marijuana has cannabinoids inside of it, 50 to 100, depending on the plant, that are the chemical compounds that are creating the various effects. So THC, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, is the substance that makes a person high and is usually what's being talked about. And then most people have heard of CBD today as well, cannabidiol. We'll talk about hemp for a second, which is a low THC cannabis plant. And then it's good to know that this drug is kind of in a drug class all by itself. It's called a psychotogenic. That means marijuana causes psychosis, delusions, delirium, auditory and visual hallucinations. Drugs that are classified as hallucinogens usually just cause visual hallucinations. So looking at this brain and understanding marijuana, we need to know the term and understand the endocannabinoid receptor system. It's made up of CB1 and CB2 receptors that are all over your entire body. And your body makes its own cannabinoids when it needs this system to run. THC, well, there are several cannabinoids it can make. The one we're starting to hear a lot about is called anandamide. THC is, again, a cannabinoid, and it rides on that system. And in fact, it competes with anandamide for the system. You can see the molecular similarities, which means they both fit into the receptors. But THC always knocks anandamide off and takes over the system. So some people will hear this and ask, so if THC is mimicking anandamide and doing something that my body's already doing, doesn't that make marijuana better for me or less harmful? The short answer to that is no, and the longer answer is because of homeostasis. When your body is always looking for balance. And so your brain has to respond when it gets inundated with too many cannabinoids, like when a person is smoking marijuana. One of the responses is that it will turn off the receptors on the receiving side of a brain cell. You can see in the lower right-hand corner. This is a real physiological event. In this top picture, we see anandamide going across the top of a brain cell, crossing the synaptic gap and getting picked up on the receiving side of the brain cell and cycling on through the brain. This is an MRI of this natural and normal function. This is THC going across the top of the brain cell, crossing the synaptic gap and running into these shutdown receptors and then stumbling on through the brain. And this is an MRI of that dysfunctional activity. The holes or the dark spots that you see in that picture are not holes, but that's where neural activity and blood flow have slowed way down. So what does the endocannabinoid system do? If we look at the brain, there are 6 areas where we have massive amounts of CB1 and CB2 receptors, and that tells us that anandamide is needed for those to function properly. The endocannabinoid system at a high level governs memory and movement and motivation. These are the 6 regions that are involved. You have an idea, it sparks in the frontal lobe, it's held in working memory. your brain goes to the hippocampus and gets everything it knows about something. Let's say the idea is go catch a ball. It goes and gets all of its memories about catching a ball. It brings them back, and the basal ganglia organizes the body to take that action. And then the cerebellum gets involved and does all the fine motor refinements so that you can finish that action. The amygdala is a very emotional processing center. It's where facial recognition comes from. And the nucleus accumbens is part of the pleasure reward pathway. It's where dopamine is fired off. And we know marijuana is addictive because it activates the nucleus accumbens. Anything that does that has the potential to become addictive. So marijuana can slow down movement. It degrades things like athletic performance over time. Memory can become less robust, affecting learning of all kinds, and emotional growth and motivation can fade. As the ability to feel pleasure goes away and relationships become more difficult. This last point here is also violence can increase with long-term users. And this is kind of counterintuitive. Everyone thinks this drug is the chill drug, but it actually can lead to quite violent and erratic behavior. If anyone's interested in that, this book, Tell Your Children by Alex Berenson, covers this whole topic in detail, and it's actually quite well written. So let's move and talk about teenage brains, because what we were just talking about was true for any brain, any age brain, and anyone who's using. There's this narrative out there that we need to deschedule marijuana so that we can research it. Well, more research is always good, but we have a ton, tens of thousands of studies on marijuana. And we know a lot about its harms. We see psychosis and psychotic breaks. We see it as a causal factor in schizophrenia now. We see real IQ loss up to 8 points in young users. We see the increases in anxiety and depression. We see something called amotivational syndrome, which is exactly what you would think it is. It is a diagnosable condition that is probably a malfunction of the amygdala. And dauntingly, we see incredibly high levels of suicide and suicide attempts among heavy users. We see physical harms like brains that are measurably smaller. There's a vomiting syndrome called hyperemesis. And this idea that you're going to consume a toxin and there aren't going to be any physical implications has always been wrong. We see all kinds of lung issues, enlarged hearts, heart attacks, stroke, and THC does cross the placental barrier. It does cross the brain-blood barrier and causes fetal damage. We see lots of cancers, a lot of them in the reproductive space. And so it's just, the drug is not trivial. So our kids will sometimes fight us and challenge us on things. There are two major questions that they tend to fight about. One is marijuana addictive? We've really kind of covered that, but it is important to know that about 30% of marijuana users, again, users who've used in the last 30 days, are likely to have an addiction or a use disorder. We know it's addictive because we already said it activates the nucleus accumbens, but it also meets the criteria for all kinds of biological addiction factors. Things like people can create or can build tolerance to it. They can experience withdrawal symptoms. People who use despite negative consequences, that's a major indicator of addiction. The other thing about marijuana that is so fascinating is that it's lipophilic. If we were in a room together, I'd ask who knows what that means, but I'll just go ahead and tell you. It means fat soluble. And it's one of there's really very few drugs that are fat soluble, recreational drugs that are fat soluble. And so this is something to really remember about it. Let me explain how it works. We're going to compare it to alcohol, which is water soluble. So if a person drinks, the ethanol goes to the brain, makes them drunk. Within 24 hours, it washes out of their system by the alcohol being carried to the excretory systems. So peeing and sweating and breathing. In contrast, when a person smokes a joint, the THC goes to their bloodstream, heads to their brain, they get high. While they're still high, their body starts pulling all the other THC out of their bloodstream and depositing it into the fatty tissues around the body. This is what your body does to handle all kinds of fat-soluble toxins, by the way. Anyway, once a person's done being high and they're more at stasis, the body will start leaching that THC back into the bloodstream to be carried to those excretory systems. Sweating, peeing, breathing. While that's happening, it's the tiniest little bit of impairment. And it's not something where someone would feel or seem high when it's happening, but it is something that gets picked up on drug tests. So if you've ever heard when somebody say, well, I tested positive for marijuana, but I used like 2 weeks ago, this is the reason. Marijuana stays in the system for a long time. It accumulates over time. If it hasn't cleared and you use again, it just accumulates on top of it. It makes the clearing time longer. Yeah, so we also know that this drug is very potent. We'll talk about that in a minute. The second big question you hear or statement you will hear is no one's ever died from marijuana. Well, in fact, that's kind of true because marijuana does not shut down the brainstem like drugs that kill through overdose do. And remember those 6 regions, the brainstem was not one of the regions where we have massive amounts of CB1 receptors or CB2 receptors. So it doesn't kill you the way an opioid or alcohol can, but you very much can overdose on marijuana. That vomiting syndrome is an overdose state, and it creates psychosis and psychotic breaks, which are absolutely overdose states. And in all of those scenarios, people end up in the hospital. The other thing about a psychotic break, and just so you know what it is, it's a break from reality. It's where the brain stops processing normally, the circuitry gets rearranged, memories start to get dissected, and lots of times they'll get kind of restored in pretty frightening ways. So it can cause all kinds of really disturbing experiences. And in psychotic states, all kinds of death occurs: suicide, homicide, and accidental death. And as bad as that is, probably the worst thing about a psychotic break is that only about 50% that experience it return to their pre-break normal. And that can be very mild compromise and be very major compromise. And that percentage drops the more times a person experiences a break. The other way, or the last way people die from marijuana, is through traffic fatalities, and these are increasing massively across the country. All right, so that concludes kind of the brain science piece, and it kind of is in line with everything else we were talking about with brain science. Teens are in this really cool place to figure out who they are, what fires off dopamine in their brains, what motivates them, what doesn't, and marijuana gets in the way of all of that. Quickly, I want to talk to you about forms and potencies, because this is nothing like when we were in high school. Today, there are 4 major forms. The plant form, which we would know, in as recently as the 1990s, if a person smoked a joint, they would consume about 3% THC. Today, there is nothing on the market less than 18% THC. Most of it's in the mid-20s in terms of plant marijuana. So at baseline, this drug is 6 times stronger than anything we experienced in high school. Then we have figured out how to extract that THC from the plant and get rid of the plant body, and we're left with liquid and solid concentrates. Liquid is what is vaped, and solid concentrates are what are dabbed. The National Marijuana Vape brand boasts 85% THC in their cartridges, and most dabs are considered almost pure THC. Those concentrates can be added to all foods and drinks, and they are, and it has created this new class of products called edibles. Those concentrates can also be added to really any other type of product. And so I could call it a 5th category, but I don't. But we have a tremendous number of marijuana-infused products: lotions, salves, tampons, tinctures, toothpicks. The products are pretty endless. So just to show you some pictures, if you haven't seen this stuff lately, that is marijuana plants growing. That's 6 growing in a house. That was part of what we legalized in 2016 in our state. The little dried flower is what is actually put in a bong or in a joint and smoked. We have 2 types of vaping systems: an open system that uses the little vials of liquid, and then a closed system like Juul that has cartridges of liquid. That's picture of a dab or a solid form, solid THC. You'll hear that called shatter, wax, butter. That device to the side is called a dab rig, and it's one of the ways in which that is heated up and consumed. These are a couple pictures of edibles. You know, the tricky thing about edibles is they take longer to feel the effects, or it takes longer to feel the effects because the THC is going through your digestive system to get to your bloodstream versus through your lungs, which is a direct access to your bloodstream. That means that new users will overeat lots of times, trying to make that high come on. Lots of people end up in the hospital because of edibles. And then there's also just massive amounts of THC in these products. That candy bar has 420 milligrams of THC in it. That cookie is kind of famous. It has 1,000 milligrams of THC in it. And then depending on how refined the concentrate is, you can add it to your own baked goods. And that cookie in the middle is just, you know, if it didn't have the marijuana garnish, you wouldn't necessarily know that it had any THC in it if that concentrate was highly refined and all the smell and taste was taken out of it. So in case there was any doubt, our Surgeon General several years ago came out and said there's no amount of marijuana that's safe for adolescents or pregnant women because of everything we've talked about. However, cannabinoids seem to keep coming. We said we'd talk about hemp. This is a hemp plant and a marijuana plant. They look exactly the same. The only difference is that the 2018 Farm Bill established a definition for hemp as being less than 0.3% THC. But it was by weight, and that by weight qualifier meant that a lot of THC could be extracted out of hemp plants and put into products. We also have a chemistry problem with hemp. Remember how I said there's 50 to 100 cannabinoids in the marijuana plant? Well, they're coming out of hemp and they are intoxicating, and or they're manipulated in labs. And we have now Delta 8, Delta 10, THCO that are all addictive. And just because the Farm Bill did not contemplate these or was silent on it, they are being allowed to exist in the marketplace right now. Okay, so on a happy note, that happy note, let's move to a less happy note, and let's talk about fentanyl for a second. Well, all right. In 2021, we had 101,000 overdose deaths. Of those, 1,100 of them were among adolescents. So that number is horrible, but it's not as daunting as some of us might think these overdose deaths are. That said, beginning in 2020, adolescents started experiencing a greater relative increase in overdose mortality versus the overall population. There was huge exponential increase in overdose deaths for our kids that were being caused by fentanyl. So what is fentanyl? It's a very powerful synthetic opioid. It's 100 times stronger than morphine. But we know opioids through prescription drugs. We have Percocet and Vicodin and Codone. The street opioid is heroin. And so to understand what's really happening with fentanyl today, we kind of have to understand drugs in our country. So bear with me on this. We have two major categories of drugs in the country. The first is our prescription or legal drug market. This is where a doctor writes you a prescription that you go and get filled in a pharmacy and take according to that prescription. Again, this is the process you see here, and it's the legal process. Secondly, we have the illicit drug market or the black market, and that's where drug cartels and other illicit drug makers are formulating and selling drugs via drug dealers on the street. And now increasingly, the street means the internet and through social media. Snapchat chat especially has been in the news a lot lately as one of the main tools used in drug dealing. These are drugs like heroin and cocaine and MDMA or Molly or ecstasy, meth, amphetamines. And so you know, we have always had something called diversion, and that's where bad actors in those legal markets will sell their prescription drug supply outside the pharmacy channel. So selling drugs out the back door of the pharmacy, or doctors that overprescribe opioids, or end users who sell their prescription instead of take it. And the DEA has always worked on reducing diversion of all kinds. However, we now have fentanyl that has become the illicit drug manufacturers and distributors' new compound of choice. And that is because it is so potent and so inexpensive to make. So now we have adulterated illicit drugs. So that means heroin, cocaine, meth, molly that are laced with fentanyl or just replaced entirely by fentanyl and sold through the illicit channels as if they were cocaine or molly or ecstasy, what have you. We also have a fake prescription market where there are people and organizations that press pills with a little bit of fentanyl and a little bit of binder to look like pills that you would normally get through the pharmacy. And this is where our kids really get into trouble or have problems. It's with these counterfeit pills. They think they're buying an Adderall or an oxycodone from a legitimate source online, which is a wrong belief, but they think they're legitimate sources online. It arrives, they take it, and it kills them. Only 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be lethal. You can see the amount in that little glass vial. And again, the cost is so low. It's like $60 to manufacture an ounce of fentanyl. And that ounce of fentanyl at 2 milligrams per pill can create 14,000 pills. It's just staggering. Okay, for a tiny bit of good news, there is something called Narcan. And Narcan is really kind of a miracle compound. It can truly reverse an opioid overdose. It is available from a pharmacist. You have to buy it from the pharmacist, but it does not require a prescription. And another great thing about it is you can't hurt someone if you misadminister it. So if someone actually is having a heart attack and you think they're overdosing and you administer Narcan, it's not going to do anything in their system to hurt them further. It's not going to help their heart attack, but if they had been overdosing, it would have brought them back, but it doesn't hurt them if you misuse it. So who should carry Narcan? We know all of our EMTs and police and fire are carrying it now. It is pretty standard operating procedure for schools to have it on campus. I do know that De La Salle and Carondelet both have it on campus. And then there's some disagreement about whether you or I should carry it, right? Some people say, oh my gosh, yes, you could never be too sure and too safe. And other people are like, never going to encounter it. What is typically agreed upon is that if there is anyone in your life that uses a substance with great regularity, you probably want to carry it. Like we talked about, the step off to other drugs happens quickly. It usually happens without planning or warning. And so it becomes like carrying an EpiPen in those situations. All right, lastly, on this topic, hold on. It is important to dispose of all of our drugs properly, whether the prescription or over the counter. And the DEA has 2 national take-back days. The next one's coming up pretty quick in April 22nd, on April 22nd. We'll give you a link for how you can check into that. So let's get back to the framework. We're at number 4, talk early and talk often. And we are going to just try and power through this and see how quickly we can get through. It has always been our responsibility to help our kids navigate this topic. And in fact, there's really no neutral position anymore when it comes to marijuana. If you're quiet about it, your kids are going to assume you're okay with it because the rest of the world seems to be okay with it. And we know with fentanyl, silence can be deadly. Again, some good news is that our influence as parents actually really profoundly matters. And I know for me, I really appreciated knowing this because in my household, my teenagers were masters at making me feel like my input was not welcome and not useful in any way, shape, or form. But in fact, when we look statistically, children whose parents talk to them about the risks of drugs and alcohol, whether they're talking back or not, are about 50% less likely to use substances. And over 80% of young people ages 10 to 18 say their parents are a leading influence in their decisions to drink or not drink. So let's talk about ways to make that influence really count. First of all, as a parent, you want to find your tone and your technique for this. And I can tell you that things we're going to talk about will work for some families. They're not going to work for other families. They'll work for some of your kids. They won't work for your other kids. But we start by, first of all, needing to be informed. If we're going to have conversations and talk about something, we need to know a little bit about what we're talking about. You want to get credible information, do things like you're doing right now. So you're on your way. We want to be in conversation with our kids, ask them lots of questions, lots of open-end questions, really hear them talk. There's all kinds of effective listening skills out there right now that are meant to create a space for difficult and awkward conversations. We can role play and run scenarios with our kids. Well, what if your best friend shows up with a gummy when she's sleeping over on Friday night? And listen to them talk. They have very interesting ideas. If you hear something that's really disturbing, respond for sure, but let them talk. Developing code words, especially for 9th and 10th graders, kids that aren't driving quite yet, that you guys can use if they get into a situation that they need help getting out of. They can text you a certain thing or call you and you'll know they need some help. Then we want to talk about adult modeling. And whenever I'm talking to parents, some parents will get a little squirmy about this. And I want to just start out by saying your glass of wine in an evening does not justify their using weed on the weekends. We hear that all the time. Well, you use, so what's the big deal? There's a big deal. And it's everything we've been talking about. So no, because I'm having a glass of wine, you don't get to smoke a joint. That's not how it works. That said, our behavior does affect our kids' behavior. And if you want to do a quick check in on what you're modeling in the world of drugs and alcohol, we do this thing called the stress joy social check-in. And this flyer is part of the handout, or links that you'll get later. But essentially what this very simply says is look at those events that or moments that are about stress, joy, or sociality, and look to see if they always include alcohol or weed. And this is not an indictment of your life, but if they do, add some that do not. The goal is to let your kids see a wider variety of how we celebrate and how we express happiness and how we deal with our stress. We can also start paying attention to whether we are verbalizing our emotions at all. Increasingly, we are all on screens. And so we're processing our emotions very quietly and our kids are not seeing us do it. Become louder. Walk into the house and say, I've had a really bad day. I'm going to go for a walk. Come back, report. Okay, that worked. I feel a lot better. Or that didn't work. I'm going to go try taking a bath. Who's going to handle dinner? Let them see you processing. Validate their resilient behaviors. Again, this playback, we've kind of talked about this some. Evidence, when you see them coping, let them know. When you see them handling stress, let them know. And really, in some ways, our coping mechanisms are just the things that make us happy. Even recognizing that, oh my God, you seem so relaxed when you're listening to music, or you seem so great when you get back off the field or back from grandma's house or whatever it is. So they start to understand that they do have ways in which they deal with life. Exercise your parental right to know. Sometimes we get a little skittish about this with high school. We want to give them some space. And yes, that is in fact good. But we know from all that brain development piece that we still need to be involved. It is appropriate to call a family where the party is supposed to be and say, hey, I hear you're having a party. Just wanted to check in. About 30% of the time you'll hear, oh, didn't know we were having a party. For whatever that's worth. When you establish that there is a party, you want to ask the next question. Okay, just curious, are you allowing drugs and alcohol? And about 30% of the time you're going to hear, oh yeah, we're going to take everybody's keys. We're going to make sure everybody's safe. We don't want anybody to get hurt. And so what you've done in that moment is you have gathered information. And so now what do you want to do with it? You can do anything with it. I mean, if it's your style and you want to proselytize for a minute and say, you know what, I'm not sure that's really a good idea, go ahead. Or if you want to say, you know what, okay, I'll talk to my son and daughter, but so you know, my kids aren't allowed to drink. And I expect them to follow that room on that rule on their own, but I just wanted you to know. Or you can say, okay, thanks, and get off the phone. And then it's a conversation with your kid. And anything you want to do with that information is appropriate. If you are no, you're not going to a party where there's drugs and alcohol. It's not who we are. We're not doing that. Completely appropriate. If you want to say, well, okay, there's going to be drugs and alcohol, and have a conversation. What do you think about that? You know, should you go? How would you handle it? What's going to happen? And then you can say, no, you can't go. Or then you can say, well, okay, let's try this. I also have a good friend who always like, you know what? Going to a party and not drinking is a life skill. There's going to be a million times when you are going to have to get up in the morning and you can't have a hangover, or you don't want to be stupid in front of your boss, that you don't want to drink. So this is a life skill. So absolutely, you can go, but you do not have my permission to drink. And I am going to be up when you get home, and I want to hear all about it. The other thing is to stay connected with other parents. Again, in high school, this can be kind of hard. Friends change. And then also in private school, you haven't been K through 8 with these people. That actually was true for me with one of my daughters, where we showed up at a new high school. I didn't know any of these people, but those back channel connections can be so important. Always had a couple girlfriends that I would call and say, okay, what about this party? What's happening Saturday night? Who's going to be there? Are your kids going? What do we, is it going to be drugs? Is it going to be alcohol? What do we think? And it's good to have the information, but it's also really great to reduce your own anxiety so that you can deal with your kid better. I mean, pounding on our kids, okay, are they going to be drinking, or who's going to be there? I mean, they don't want to have that conversation with us. And quite frankly, they probably don't even know. So to get that information in other places and then be able to have the conversation you want to have your kids can be really useful. The other thing is those back channel parents can know you and what your feelings are about drugs and alcohol, and you can be open with these parents, with any parents. Look, my kid's not supposed to be drinking. If you see him drinking, I want you to tell me. Because lots of parents aren't sure if they should tell when they see a child drinking. So clear it up. Say you want to know if you want to know. The other thing, if you have family history of addiction, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, sharing that with people can be really useful so they understand the importance of this topic. Lastly, parenting peer groups are becoming kind of a public health norm right now. Be in relationship with the parents of your kids' friends. It just changes all kinds of things. Okay, so the communication goals with all this is to establish the expectation of no use. If no use is not going to play in your family, delay. This is a conversation about delay. Right time, right place, right thing. Right now is not the right time. So you're just delaying. Sometimes that works better. Help your kids find reasons to say no, not just ways to say no, but reasons to say no. Again, broadening the concept beyond Friday night. Help them look at the bigger picture. What are they trying to achieve? What are their interests? What do they think they want to do? Is being really drunk on a Friday night for 3 hours really in line with all of that? It can kind of help add some perspective. Sorry. Lastly, just to offer some frames of reference. So, because I can sit and have this conversation and throw out all these ideas, but if we are going to be honest, conversations about drugs and alcohol with our kids are never easy. And as they get older, they get more horrible, lots of angry fights, yelling, screaming, and finding different ways to say why this is important to us can be helpful, just to break that cycle, or just to try to come at it a different way so that we can have conversations with them. And one of those ways is to talk about it in terms of who they are in the world. I mean, we know their strengths and their weaknesses. You know, many of us probably believe they have God-given talents and purpose on this earth, and we don't want anything getting in the way of that. We don't want anything changing that or disrupting that. Also, when it comes to marijuana, we are just not going to have any conversation that doesn't recognize that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that has one goal, and that is to sell you drugs. It is not about social justice. It is not about anything euphoric. It is not about self-actualization. It is about the bottom line, and what happens to you and your life is of absolutely no concern to this industry. And then the other thing is family history. So addiction is hereditary, and kids that have addiction close in their family are at about a 50% greater risk of becoming addicted themselves. And addiction in the family is a really difficult topic to talk about. Some people talk about it all the time. Some are not even at a place where they're acknowledging it. And so it can be really difficult. But I will tell you, it can be incredibly prophylactic. It's not going to, you know, not every child is going to say something about it in every situation, but we know lots of kids that say to their friends, hey, I can't use, I'm just at a different risk than you are. And lots of times their friends back off. So it's a tool to arm them with. Okay, so this is a lot. I know this is like drinking from a fire hose, and I apologize, but we do have just a couple more things we want to go through. So bear with me for about 5 or 6 more minutes, maybe 7. Anyway, we wanted to take a look at some of those perspectives from earlier on. That first one of, we turned out okay. And so what's the big deal? And if we turned out okay, that is great. We are on the right side or the positive side of those statistics. Either way, we always encourage parents to think back a little more deeply. We hear most people say this. I know it was true for myself. When I do look back with a little more discerning eye, there's all kinds of people that I know that have struggled with substances since high school. We have, let's see, one person that has enabled closed caption. I don't know if I need to do anything like that, so I'm going to just keep going. I have friends that have been on Prozac since the 1980s after they had a bad trip from 3% marijuana. I mean, the glory days are not as glory as we think, as we've kind of stored them lots of times. And then this idea of having kids use in my home. And I really want to recognize the positive intent in that these parents really are trying to keep kids safe and really trying to find some kind of balance, for their kids. So that's definitely to be applauded. But I do want to add some counter arguments to this tendency. And one is it's actually against the law to serve anyone other than your children who are under 21 alcohol, marijuana, or nicotine. There are real civil and criminal risks that parents are taking on when they're serving kids that aren't their own. And there are also social host ordinances that actually govern against this in most of our communities. The bigger issue, though, is I don't think parents ever really factor in the mental health status of the children that are being served in their home. You just can't know what it is. You don't know their addiction profile. You don't know what their histories are, what their tendencies might be. And to be a part of setting a kid off on just a horrible life of addiction is not something any parent is ever thinking about. Lastly, this question about should we allow minors to drink is not new. This has been confounding parents for decades, so much so that the NIH did a meta-analysis of about 22 different studies, and they published all their findings in a report titled "Providing Alcohol to Underage Youth: What Messages Should We Be Sending to Parents of All Explicit Things?" There is a summary of it in the handouts as well. That analysis showed that teens that were allowed to drink at home were more likely to drink elsewhere. They drank larger amounts and in larger quantities, and they drank and drove more regularly than kids that were not allowed to drink at home. So allowing kids to drink at home does keep them safe in that moment, but the numbers show that it might be counterproductive if we're talking about a long-term goal of safety. I can teach my kids to drink responsibly. I think we've kind of talked about that enough. The teen brain is just not in a place to where it's going to learn how to drink responsibly. And then lastly, I need my kids to experiment before they go to high school, or in high school before they go to college. This is another one that I think is incredibly intuitive, and I really appreciate where it's coming from. And in fact, our kids are going to face alcohol in college, and depending on where they go to college, and they're going to face a tremendous amount of drug use as well. And they're going to have to make some real decisions about it. And a lot of our kids are going to go a little crazy in college anyway, no matter what they did or didn't do in high school. But all that said, there is research that shows that all outcomes are better, even when kids start to drink in college, if they did not use in high school. And then there's also a school of thought that says it's better for teens to show up to college having not used and having a really extensive experience with abstinence, so that they know they can have fun without drugs, and they know they can feel connected and find friends without substances. So it's kind of these experiences that are really the most protective. Okay, a few more minutes. That last one of the One Choice 5 parenting basics, and that is act quickly if you suspect use. And that is because there's a lot of risk associated with use. Not every child that drinks or smokes in high school is going to experience problems, but almost every adult who struggles with addiction started using something when they were young. To be clear, adult addiction is now seen as a pediatric onset disease. And the numbers are that 90% of adults who suffer from addiction started their use of some substance before they were 18. Alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, other things before they were 18. This chart shows that about 30% of our 16 to 17-year-olds who are drinking today may suffer when they get older, if not before. So every young person who is using in high school is increasing their risk of adverse consequences. In addition to addiction, we have this narrative out there: if a teen is using regularly, they are medicating an underlying mental illness. That very well may be true, and you want to activate to figure out what that is and see if there is a way to solve that. It is also equally true that they can be creating mental illnesses through their use. We also know that kids that are using young have a greater risk or greater chance of becoming victims or perpetrators of sexual assault. Impaired driving is a problem. Decline in academic achievement is a problem. And criminal justice issues start popping up. These drugs are all legal, but not for anyone under 21. Bob DuPont, who's actually the lead of that organization, IBH, sums it up pretty nicely. There is no problem so bad that alcohol and drugs cannot make it worse. So I just want to end back on that kind of, I don't know why I like this so much. I think it's the hopefulness of it, the opportunity of adolescence. They're learning to cope, they're learning to connect, they're learning to build intimacy, problem solve, and have fun. We want to focus on that. We want to help them get there. And then lastly, we just want to say, if you or your child are struggling with any of these topics, we strongly encourage you to get help. Do not isolate. Do not feel shame. This is not shameful. This is happening to families everywhere. And so we encourage you to start with pediatricians, and then we know that there's great counselors at De La Salle, and the Cannon Wellness Center at Carondelet is perfectly suited for this kind of thing as well. So let's ask some questions if anybody has any, and here's some more resources.
Yeah, Debbie, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
This first person says, thank you for such a great presentation. Can you please share how and where this data was collected from? Actually, there's multiple questions. Let's start with that one.
Okay, so the data is collected from just a myriad of places. And if you are looking for a source list, if you want to get in touch with me, I can give you a detailed source list. There are two major studies. That one is called Monitoring the Future, and one is called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. They are annual surveys that have been going on for the last 5 decades. And so all of the statistics that I showed you about use and those charts, they all came from either Monitoring the Future or the National Survey.
Okay, the second part of this question says, how are teenagers and young adults answering these questions? So if you have any information or information from any of our sources about how teenagers and young adults are reporting?
So all of the statistics that I gave you were from teenagers. So these studies are 30 or 40,000 surveyees. They're all in different age groups. And so all of the data that I showed you was either 12 to 17-year-olds or high school seniors. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but I'm not sure what else.
And then this last bit of the question, I think, is more for the 2 schools. So I'll answer it live, which is, were surveys given out at school asking about their use of alcohol and drugs? And the answer for Carondelet and De La Salle is no, there were no surveys given out at school asking about student use of alcohol and drugs. Having said that, though, we are planning on putting out a survey before the end of the month asking about topics that our students, both at Carondelet and De La Salle, feel like they need to know more about, or that they wish their classmates knew more about. So we're not asking about anyone's particular usage, but more about topics that they feel that they're missing information and that they want more about, or they wish their school community knew more about. And those survey results will be used to help us craft the drug and alcohol prevention programming for next spring, next March, where we will be doing school-wide assemblies on this topic, freshmen and sophomores on one campus, juniors and seniors on the other. And so the surveys will help us in that effort. So letting everyone know that. Another question that we have up here, does asking, and this is referring back to, I think, checking in with parents who are putting on a party. This person asked, does asking if drugs or alcohol will be present at a party to the host parents portray any judgment, or do host parents understand intentions of the parent who's asking?
That is a very astute question, and every host parent is probably going to have a different response to that. I can tell you my own experience in the times that I've done this. One parent did not appreciate it, for sure, and she did feel like I was judging her, and I did everything to try to say that I'm not, and I've got a ton of addiction in my family, and I'm just trying to, help my kids stay safe. She never would hear about it. But the other 10, 12 were fine. They just accepted it as I was curious. And you just want to try to be as authentic and as honest as you can. It's not about them, it's about your kid, and you're trying to decide how you need to prepare your kid, or how you want to talk to your kid about it. The other thing too, just to be realistic, alcohol and drugs can get into parties, and parents who had no intention of allowing it can not know that it's there. So there's no reason to think that even if a parent is adamant that it's not going to happen, that it's still not going to happen. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a good question.
Okay, are there any other questions? You can go ahead and type them in the chat or in the Q&A actually. And while we're waiting to see if there's any last questions, I just wanted to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded. It'll take us a few days to do a little bit of editing, but we will have that up on the Cronzolet YouTube channel and be sharing that out. As well as the extensive number of resources that Debbie has collected. Those will be posted as well for people to see both on the Cronzolet and De La Salle websites, as well as in the information when we post this webinar. Okay, there is a question that came in. It says, how have you seen schools respond to learning about teens and use that supports honesty?
I mean, honesty, like, admit that you're using in a public space or a classroom space. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that. We hope that our kids are being honest with their peers. It would be great if they're being honest with us. I don't know that is always going to be the case. I'm not even entirely sure it's the most important goal. Empowering them with they choose is, I think really the goal, and that we hope they're empowered with enough information that they're choosing not to use. And they're doing that from an authentic place and a place that makes sense to them.
I think also perhaps this is also what this this person is asking in terms of when a school administration becomes aware that a student of theirs is using or has used, in terms of basically how does a school choose to deal with that could support people being a little bit more willing to be honest. And I would say that more and more schools, and I can say, and I'll speak for Cronzolet alone, and again, Spencer Shively is someone who can respond to that. If you have questions about this, you can reach out directly to him. But from Cronzolet's perspective, that many times if we find that a student has been using or has an issue with that, we first go about it by really thinking about why is this happening? Is there perhaps an addiction aspect to it, or other things that are going on in that student's life? And we will start necessarily, not necessarily from a point of punishment, but really looking at restorative approaches, which could include a wellness contract. It could include working closely with a family, with outside medical professionals and things like that to best support that student with what's going on in that student's life that may be leading them perhaps to use, and really going about it first from that aspect. And what we have found is that not always, of course, but that has helped with student honesty on the front end. And then we have a parent saying that thank you. This evening was very informative.
Okay, very good. Glad to hear it.
Okay. Oh, and here's another question. It says, how do you go about asking a host if there will be adult supervision in a party, especially if there are young adults driving and may have consumed alcohol and may have passengers in their vehicle, thinking of the responsibility of a host for allowing teenagers to drink and then drive under the influence? It's a good question.
It is a good question. So it's worth it to ask. I think the differentiation between the kids that can drive and the kids that can't is a very intuitive one that you're making there. And we do parent and need to parent a little bit different when our kids can't drive versus when our kids can drive. And I think it's a completely, honest question to ask, is there going to be adult supervision? And if it's your personality, offer to help, that's another, proactive way to tackle the problem. If it's not, don't, there's no reason to put yourself in that situation. But you can also, even offer to use your Uber account, or, you can even approach it that way. Does someone have an Uber account that, they're going to be calling rides for people if kids are drinking? And or just, is there anything we can do to make sure nobody gets in the car after they've been drinking and and make sure they don't have any passengers with them? And some parents have actually thought this through, and they do have, designated drivers kind of identified, and or the kids will designate drivers as well. Not driving intoxicated is fairly taboo. I mean, kids still do it, but more and more kids will get in an Uber than they would drive intoxicated. What a lot of kids don't understand is they can't drive while they're high. There's still kind of a general, I don't know how you describe it, but people just are not making that connection, that it's the same thing. Impairment is impairment. You can't drive under the influence of anything, even a prescription drug. So I don't know. I think it would be a great thing to just ask a parent and see what happens. I think you'd be pleasantly surprised at the response.
Okay. Well, thank you, Debbie, for being with us this evening. It was lots of really good information. So really appreciate your expertise. Again, to everyone that is on the webinar, we are going to provide this webinar in a video version on the Crondelet YouTube, and we'll be posting all of the resources that Debbie has prepared on the Crondelet website. They'll also be posted on the De La Salle website, and will be in the information section under this particular video recording. If you have any questions that come up in the meantime, before all of those resources go live, please don't hesitate to reach out to Spencer Shively at De La Salle, or myself, Jennifer Reinwald at Crondelet. If you need to speak with a counselor, there are counselors at De La Salle. Every De La Salle student has an assigned counselor. And at Crondelet, you can always reach out to Stacy Bisagno, Sarah Alpert, or Geneva Green, who are our wellness counselors that oversee the Cannon Wellness Center. We also, both schools have access to and can connect you with lots of resources as well. So hope everyone has a good rest of the evening, and we'll see you soon at a future school event. Thank you very much, Debbie.